The cruelest wounds are not made by claws, they are made by the laughter of those who believe you are worth less than everyone else. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you believe that kindness is stronger than cruelty, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories remind us that true strength is revealed through compassion. Now, back to Claire. The first snowfall of winter had transformed Silvermoon Keep into something almost magical. White flakes drifted gently across towering stone walls, settling upon ancient gargoyles and frozen ivy that climbed the castle towers. Hundreds of lanterns glowed warmly against the icy darkness, casting golden reflections over polished marble courtyards where noble wolves arrived in elegant horse-drawn carriages. The scent of roasted venison, honeyed bread, cinnamon wine, and burning cedar drifted through the crisp evening air, while musicians played graceful melodies beneath silk banners embroidered with silver wolves beneath the full moon. Tonight was the Moon Ascension Banquet, the grandest celebration of the year. Every alpha, beta, noble family, military commander, and respected elder from dozens of packs had gathered beneath one roof to honor the coming of the winter moon. More importantly, everyone hoped to catch a glimpse of the man whispered about across every kingdom. Alpha King Alexander Ashford, the strongest alpha alive. Some claimed he had defeated 3 rival alphas without shifting into his wolf form. Others believed he possessed the blessing of the moon goddess herself. No one truly knew the truth. Only one fact remained undeniable. Where Alexander walked, entire kingdoms listened. Yet inside the magnificent Great Hall, no one was speaking about the king. They were speaking about someone far less important. Claire Bennett. If she spills another tray tonight, she'll embarrass the entire pack. I still don't understand why they allow a rejected Omega inside the castle. Perhaps the servants felt sorry for her. Soft laughter spread through the noble guests. Claire heard every word. She always did. But years of quiet endurance had taught her that answering cruelty only gave it more life. She lowered her eyes and continued carrying a polished silver tray filled with crystal goblets of ruby red wine. At 19, Claire looked nothing like the noble ladies surrounding her. While they shimmered beneath embroidered velvet gowns decorated with pearls and silver thread, she wore a simple pale blue dress that had been mended so many times the careful stitches had become part of its design. It was clean, neat, beautiful in its simplicity, yet impossible to mistake for nobility. Her long golden blonde hair had been braided carefully behind her shoulders. Loose strands framed her delicate face, softened by gentle sapphire blue eyes that always seemed to carry more kindness than sadness. Even after years of rejection, there was still warmth inside them. Perhaps that was what puzzled people most. How could someone who had received so little from the world continue offering it gentle smiles? An older kitchen maid approached quietly. Claire. She turned immediately. Yes, Mrs. Helen? The elderly woman carefully adjusted the sleeve of Claire's dress. You've been working since sunrise. I'm all right. Mrs. Helen sighed. You always say that. Claire smiled softly. Because it's usually true. The older woman reached into her apron and secretly slipped a warm honey biscuit into Claire's hand. You skipped supper. Claire looked surprised. You noticed? I notice everything. The older woman smiled. And besides, you remind me of my daughter. Emotion briefly flickered across Claire's face. Thank you. Before she could take another bite, a loud voice echoed across the hall. Omega. Claire immediately looked up. One of the banquet supervisors motioned impatiently. The Western tables need fresh wine. I'm coming. She carefully tucked the unfinished biscuit into her apron pocket. Not because she wanted to save it. Because another servant's little son often waited outside the kitchens after work. He loved honey biscuits. Claire smiled to herself. He would be happy tonight. She crossed the enormous hall gracefully, weaving between laughing nobles and towering stone pillars wrapped with evergreen garlands. The celebration grew louder. Crystal glasses clinked together. Children chased one another around marble fountains. Merchants discussed trade. Generals debated border security. Everywhere she looked, people belonged. Claire wondered, just for a heartbeat, what that might feel like. Then she quietly dismissed the thought. Dreams could become dangerous if held too tightly. Near the center of the hall stood a circle of beautifully dressed young she-wolves from the wealthiest families in Silvermoon Pack. Their laughter carried effortlessly through the room. At the center stood Vanessa Sinclair, daughter of the beta leader, 20 years old, strikingly beautiful, accustomed to admiration. She noticed Claire approaching with the wine tray. A slow smile appeared on her lips. Not a kind one. One of her friends leaned closer. "Watch this." Claire slowed as she reached their table. "Good evening." Her voice remained calm. "May I refill your goblets?" Vanessa looked Claire up and down with open amusement. "My, what a lovely dress." The girls surrounding her laughed quietly. Claire lowered her eyes. "Thank you." Vanessa lifted her crystal goblet but made no move to hand it over. Instead, she twirled the deep crimson wine slowly, watching it catch the candlelight. "You know," she said sweetly, "I've always wondered something." Claire looked up politely. "Yes." Vanessa smiled wider. "What color does humiliation become once it soaks into an Omega's dress?" Around them, several nearby conversations gradually faded. A few guests turned their heads. Some servants froze where they stood. Claire remained perfectly still, the silver tray balanced steadily in her hands. She had no idea that somewhere beyond the towering entrance doors, the arrival of Alpha King Alexander Ashford had just been announced. Vanessa's smile never reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile that appeared only when someone believed the next few seconds would become another person's worst memory. The crystal goblet shimmered beneath the candlelight. Deep crimson wine swirled lazily against the delicate glass as she tilted it ever so slightly. "What color does humiliation become?" Her voice floated sweetly through the growing silence. "Once it soaks into an Omega's dress." A few nearby noble ladies covered amused smiles behind embroidered fans. Several young alphas chuckled under their breath. Claire stood quietly before them, both hands steady beneath the polished silver tray. She answered exactly as she always had. Politely. "I'm sorry if I've done something to offend you." Vanessa laughed. "Oh, Claire. You offend us simply by pretending you belong here." The women surrounding her burst into soft laughter. One leaned toward another and whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "My maid dresses better than she does." Another added, "At least maids usually know their place." More laughter. Claire lowered her eyes. Not because she believed them. Because she refused to let tears become entertainment. Years of being overlooked had taught her something important. Cruel people rarely stopped because someone argued with them. They stopped only when they grew bored. She simply waited. Perhaps, if she remained quiet, this moment would end. Vanessa slowly stood. The ruby-colored wine caught the golden light of hundreds of candles. So many important guests tonight. She sighed dramatically. It would be tragic if someone looked cheap. Without another word, she casually flicked her wrist. The entire goblet of dark red wine splashed directly across Claire's pale blue dress. The sound was almost gentle. A soft splash. Then silence. The rich crimson liquid spread rapidly across the delicate fabric, dripping from her sleeves onto the polished marble floor. Several servants gasped. A little girl near one of the banquet tables instinctively covered her mouth. Claire herself never moved. Cold wine trickled slowly down her hands. Her apron. Her skirt. Tiny droplets gathered at the edge of the fabric before falling onto the stone beneath her feet. Vanessa looked almost pleased. Oh dear. She pressed one hand dramatically against her chest. What an unfortunate accident. The women around her laughed louder now. One clapped softly. Another shook her head with exaggerated sympathy. What a shame. That dress was almost presentable. Someone else added, I suppose it looks better now. The laughter spread outward like ripples across water. Guests turned. Whispers followed. That's the rejected Omega. I heard no Alpha ever wanted her. Poor thing. No. Another corrected quietly. Pathetic thing. Claire closed her eyes for one slow breath. Not to hide. To steady herself. When she opened them again, She simply reached into the small pocket of her apron and removed a neatly folded linen cloth. Without complaint, without anger, she knelt gracefully upon the cold marble floor. First, she wiped the spilled wine from the stone. Only afterward did she gently dab the stains soaking into her own dress. Mrs. Helen rushed forward from the kitchen entrance. "Claire." The elderly woman looked horrified. "My dear." She quickly reached for another cloth. Claire smiled softly before the older woman could speak. "It's all right." Mrs. Helen stared. "No, it isn't." Claire quietly shook her head. The guests shouldn't have to walk through spilled wine. Even now, she worried more about others slipping than about herself. Mrs. Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, child." Nearby, one of the younger kitchen servants clenched his fists. "Someone should say something." An older footman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "And lose your position?" The young man looked toward Claire. "But this isn't fair." "No," the older servant whispered sadly. "It isn't." At that exact moment, a tiny silver bracelet slipped from the wrist of a frightened little girl standing beside one of the banquet tables. It rolled across the polished floor before stopping only inches away from the spreading wine. The child looked ready to cry. "My bracelet." No one noticed. Everyone remained focused on Claire. Everyone except Claire herself. Still kneeling, she carefully reached toward the tiny bracelet before the wine could stain its delicate white ribbon. She gently wiped it clean with the only dry corner of her own cloth. Then she stood and walked toward the little girl. "I think this belongs to you." The child looked up with wide eyes. "My grandmother gave it to me." Claire smiled warmly as she fastened the bracelet around the little girl's wrist. "There. Now she won't worry." The little girl hugged Claire without hesitation. "Thank you." Claire softly brushed a loose curl away from the child's face. "You're very welcome." Several nearby guests fell unexpectedly quiet. For one brief moment, the laughter disappeared. Vanessa's smile tightened. She had expected tears. Anger. Embarrassment. Not kindness. She stepped forward again. "Still pretending to be noble?" Claire looked at her peacefully. "I'm only trying to be kind." Vanessa scoffed. "Kindness doesn't change what you are." Claire answered gently. "No, but it changes who I choose to become." Those simple words lingered quietly in the hall. Before Vanessa could respond, the enormous bronze doors at the far end of the great hall slowly opened. A cold winter breeze swept inside. Hundreds of candle flames trembled. Royal trumpets echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Every conversation stopped instantly. The master of ceremonies struck his staff against the marble floor 3 times. His powerful voice thundered throughout the hall. "His Majesty, Alexander Ashford, Alpha King of the Northern Realms." Every noble, every elder, every warrior, every servant dropped immediately onto one knee. Everyone, except Claire. She was still standing in the center of the hall, her simple blue dress stained with crimson wine, gently holding the tiny girl's hand as the most powerful alpha in the kingdom stepped through the doors. And before anyone noticed, Alexander's cold gray eyes had already found her. Iron could command obedience. Only character could command a king's attention. The great hall became so silent that even the crackling fireplaces seemed to retreat into the background. Every noble remained on one knee, heads bowed, eyes lowered. No one dared look directly at Alexander Ashford for longer than custom allowed. The Alpha King crossed the enormous hall with measured, unhurried steps. His polished black boots echoed against the marble floor. Each footstep sounded impossibly calm. Yet every sound tightened the air inside the room. He wore no crown. He never needed one. A midnight black ceremonial cloak rested across broad shoulders fastened by a silver wolf brooch older than most kingdoms. Beneath it, a dark military tunic fit his powerful frame with quiet elegance. His black hair was neatly combed back, revealing sharp features that seemed carved from stone, while his steel-gray eyes remained unreadable. The scent of cedar, winter pine, and the unmistakable presence of an alpha drifted through the hall. Power. Ancient. Controlled. Absolute. Claire finally realized everyone around her had knelt. Her blue eyes widened slightly. Oh! She immediately released the little girl's hand. You should go to your mother. The child nodded before running back toward her family. Claire quickly lowered herself onto one knee, ignoring the wine soaking into the skirt of her dress. I'm sorry. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't realize His Majesty had arrived. No one answered. Alexander continued walking. Every noble secretly assumed he was heading toward the royal platform prepared for him at the far end of the hall. It had always been that way. Kings walked forward. Others stepped aside. But halfway across the hall, he stopped. Not at the throne. Not before the elders. Not beside the beta leader. He stopped directly in front of Claire. The silence deepened. Even Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes in confusion. Alexander looked down at the young Omega kneeling before him. His gaze settled on the dark red stains covering her pale blue dress. Fresh wine still dripped quietly onto the marble floor. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Claire kept her head lowered. She could feel every pair of eyes watching. Her heartbeat became painfully loud inside her own ears. Had she broken protocol? Would she be removed from the banquet? Would she lose the only work she had? Mrs. Helen watched anxiously from the kitchen entrance, her hands clasped together in silent prayer. Please, don't let anything worse happen to that child. Alexander's voice finally broke the silence. It was your hands. Claire blinked. Slowly, she looked upward. My hands, Your Majesty? His eyes remained fixed upon the faint crimson stains covering her fingers. You cleaned the floor. Before cleaning yourself. Claire looked down at her hands, almost embarrassed. I only thought someone might slip. No one had expected that answer. Not even Alexander. His expression remained unchanged. Yet something quiet shifted behind his eyes. He glanced briefly toward the tiny silver bracelet now resting safely upon the little girl's wrist. That child. You protected something precious to her. Claire nodded gently. It belonged to her grandmother. I didn't want it ruined. Again. No anger. No complaint. Not one word about herself. The king looked at her for another long moment. Then, without warning, he removed a spotless white linen handkerchief embroidered with the royal crest. Gasps rippled across the hall. Royal cloth bearing the king's emblem was never handed to commoners. Never. Alexander crouched slightly. Before Claire could react, he gently took one of her trembling hands. His movements were careful, respectful. He used the handkerchief to wipe away the wine staining her fingers. The entire hall stared in disbelief. Vanessa's confident smile disappeared. Beta leader Richard Sinclair slowly rose from one knee in shock before quickly remembering protocol and lowering himself again. Claire's breathing caught. Your Majesty. You don't have to. Alexander calmly finished cleaning the last trace of crimson from her fingertips. Only then did he release her hand. His voice remained steady. Wine should never stay on the skin this long. Claire stared at him. No king had ever spoken to her. No alpha of status had ever touched her with kindness. She struggled to find words. Thank you. Her voice trembled. Alexander stood once more. His eyes slowly swept across the crowd. Not hurried. Not searching. Simply observing. He noticed servants avoiding eye contact. Nobles looking suddenly fascinated by their own goblets. The elders sitting unnaturally still. Fear had replaced amusement. Interesting. Someone in this room knew exactly what had happened. The Alpha King's gaze eventually settled upon the shattered confidence hiding behind Vanessa Sinclair's carefully controlled expression. She attempted a graceful smile. Your Majesty. What an unexpected honor. Alexander did not return the greeting. Instead, he spoke one calm sentence. What happened here? No one answered. The question lingered heavily beneath the vaulted ceiling. The master of ceremonies looked toward the elders. The elders looked toward the beta leader. The beta leader looked toward the servants. The servants lowered their eyes. Silence. Alexander waited. His patience somehow felt more terrifying than rage. Several nobles began shifting nervously. A young alpha quietly swallowed. An elderly merchant wiped sweat from his forehead despite the winter air. Claire slowly stood, still clutching the folded royal handkerchief. She took one hesitant step forward. Your Majesty. Every eye turned toward her. It truly isn't important. Mrs. Helen closed her eyes. Oh, Claire. Always protecting everyone except yourself. Alexander looked at the young Omega. Not important? Claire smiled with quiet sincerity. The banquet shouldn't be interrupted because of me. I can change into another dress later. And accidents happen. Vanessa immediately nodded. Exactly. It was simply an accident. Several of her friends quickly agreed. A misunderstanding. No one intended any harm. Claire lowered her gaze. She did not want anyone punished. She truly believed letting the evening continue peacefully was the kinder choice. Alexander studied her face. There was no deception there. Only compassion. Compassion. For the very people who had laughed while humiliating her. His gray eyes became colder than the snow falling outside the castle walls. He slowly turned away from Claire, then looked directly toward the assembled pack. When he spoke again, his voice carried effortlessly through every corner of the great hall. Very well. If it was merely an accident. He paused. The silence became suffocating. Then the person responsible should have no fear of stepping forward and telling me exactly how it happened. Iron silence settled over the great hall. No one moved. No one breathed louder than necessary. The Alpha King's question lingered in the air like the edge of a drawn blade. If it was merely an accident, then the person responsible should have no fear of stepping forward and telling me exactly how it happened. His voice was calm, almost gentle. That frightened them even more. Vanessa kept her practiced smile upon her face, but inside, her thoughts raced. He couldn't possibly care about a servant. A rejected Omega. This would pass. It had to. She slowly stepped forward, bowing with flawless etiquette. Your Majesty. Alexander's gray eyes settled upon her. She lowered her gaze respectfully. I am Vanessa Sinclair, daughter of Beta Richard Sinclair. I fear this misunderstanding has interrupted your arrival. Her tone was graceful, measured. The servant accidentally approached too closely while I was speaking. My hand slipped, and the wine spilled. She offered a regretful smile. I immediately apologized. Several of her friends nodded. That's exactly what happened. It was unfortunate. No one intended any disrespect. Claire instinctively opened her mouth. It truly wasn't. Alexander raised one finger. She immediately fell silent. Not because she felt scolded. Because somehow, she sensed he wished to hear everything before reaching judgment. His attention returned to Vanessa. You apologized? Yes, Your Majesty. And she accepted? Vanessa answered without hesitation. She did. Alexander slowly turned toward Claire. Did she? Claire hesitated. She disliked lying. She disliked embarrassing others even more. After several long seconds, she answered softly. Lady Vanessa expressed regret. It was not entirely false. Vanessa had called it an accident. Claire had chosen to interpret that as regret. Alexander noticed the careful wording. Interesting. Very interesting. He continued asking quietly. When the wine spilled. Were you injured? Claire looked confused. Injured. The liquid was served warm. She glanced down at the dark stain covering her dress. My hands stung a little. But they're fine. Again. No complaint. Alexander nodded once. Then his gaze shifted toward the servants standing along the walls. Who witnessed the incident? Silence answered him. Every servant stared at the floor. They knew the truth. They also knew who Vanessa's father was. One accusation could cost them their positions. Perhaps even their homes. Beta Richard Sinclair finally spoke. Your Majesty. I'm certain my daughter would never intentionally humiliate anyone. Our family has served the crown faithfully for generations. Alexander looked at him. I asked for witnesses, not character references. Richard's joy tightened. He lowered his head again. The silence became unbearable. Mrs. Helen's fingers trembled. She looked toward Claire, toward Vanessa, toward the king. Her heart pounded painfully. If she spoke, she might never work again. If she remained silent, Claire would stand alone once more. Across the hall, Claire noticed the older woman's struggle. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Your Majesty." Alexander looked at her. "Please. There is no reason for anyone else to become involved. I don't want anyone punished because of me." Mrs. Helen closed her eyes. Even now, the child protected everyone. Alexander studied Claire's expression. There was not a trace of bitterness. No hidden desire for revenge. Only genuine concern. He had spent most of his life judging warriors, politicians, generals, liars. He knew ambition when he saw it. He knew manipulation. The young woman standing before him possessed neither. That made her extraordinarily rare. One of Vanessa's friends suddenly laughed nervously. "I suppose some people simply enjoy being dramatic." A few uncomfortable chuckles followed. Alexander turned his head slowly. The laughter died instantly. He walked toward one of the long banquet tables. There, untouched goblets of red wine reflected the dancing candlelight. He picked up one crystal glass. Every eye followed the movement. He weighed it lightly in one hand. Then he spoke without looking at anyone. "Curious." His voice remained perfectly calm. "Wine falls downward." No one understood. He continued. "If a goblet slips naturally, it strikes the nearest surface." He looked toward Claire's stained dress. "The stain should begin near the waist." His eyes lifted slightly. "But these stains begin across the shoulders." He looked at Vanessa, as though the wine had been thrown from above. The room became deathly quiet. Several nobles unconsciously glanced toward Claire's dress. Only now did they notice the pattern, the direction, the spread. Alexander calmly set the empty goblet back onto the table. "I've spent 20 years studying battlefields. The smallest details often reveal the truth." Vanessa's heartbeat thundered inside her chest. She had not expected anyone to examine the evidence. Certainly not the king himself. She forced another smile. "Perhaps. I simply moved differently than I remembered." Alexander said nothing. Instead, he walked toward the little girl whose bracelet Claire had returned. The child immediately hid behind her mother. Alexander knelt slightly until his eyes met hers. His voice softened. "What is your name?" "Emily." "Were you watching earlier, Emily?" The little girl looked toward her mother. The woman nodded carefully. "If you remember something, you may tell the truth." Emily looked back toward Claire, then toward Vanessa. Her tiny fingers tightened around the silver bracelet. "The pretty lady." She pointed gently toward Claire. "Didn't do anything." A murmur swept through the hall. Emily continued innocently. "She only stood there." The other lady poured the red drink. Her mother gasped quietly. "Emily." But the child had already spoken. Children did not understand politics. They understood only what they had seen. Vanessa's face lost its color. One of her friends lowered her eyes. Another stepped backward. Alexander rose slowly. His expression remained unreadable. Yet the temperature inside the room somehow felt colder than the snow falling beyond the castle walls. His gaze settled upon Vanessa once more. "You called it an accident." He paused. "The child calls it a choice." No one dared speak. No one dared even shift their weight. Because every soul inside the Great Hall understood one terrifying truth. The Alpha King had not yet become angry. And somehow, that was far more frightening than if he had. Power does not reveal itself when it shouts. It reveals itself when an entire room becomes too frightened to breathe. No one dared look directly at Vanessa Sinclair. No one dared look away from the Alpha King. The silence stretched so long that the crackling fire inside the enormous stone hearth became the loudest sound in the Great Hall. Vanessa's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. She forced herself to inhale slowly. She was the Beta leader's daughter. The king would not disgrace her publicly. Surely, there would be another way. She lowered herself onto one knee. "Your Majesty." Her voice remained remarkably steady. "Emily is only a child. Children sometimes misunderstand what they see." The little girl's mother instinctively pulled her daughter closer. Emily hid behind her mother's dress. Alexander never looked toward the child again. He already had his answer. Instead, He calmly asked, then perhaps one of your companions would like to explain. His gray eyes swept across the young noblewomen standing beside Vanessa. One immediately lowered her head. Another stared at the marble floor. A third nervously twisted the ribbon around her wrist. Moments earlier, they had laughed the loudest. Now, not one could meet his eyes. Alexander waited. He had mastered patience long before he mastered warfare. Eventually, one quiet voice broke beneath the unbearable weight of silence. The speaker swallowed hard. It wasn't an accident. Every head turned. The young she-wolf who had spoken looked barely 20. Tears filled her eyes. Vanessa poured the wine on purpose. Vanessa's face became ghostly pale. Lillian. The frightened girl flinched. I'm sorry, she whispered. But I can't lie to the king. Another young noble slowly stepped forward. I saw it too. A third lowered her head. So did I. Like cracks spreading across frozen ice. The truth began revealing itself. No one wished to become the first liar standing before the Alpha King. Within moments, nearly every witness silently nodded. Richard Sinclair closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged beneath invisible weight. He knew. The deception had collapsed. Vanessa looked desperately toward her father. Dad. Richard could not answer. Not as her father. Not while standing before his king. Alexander remained perfectly composed. His expression never changed. Somehow, that made everything worse. He looked toward Vanessa. Do you wish to correct your statement? Her lips trembled. Pride battled fear inside her chest. Finally, she whispered, She glanced briefly toward Claire. The Omega still stood quietly nearby. Wine stained her dress. The royal handkerchief remained folded carefully inside her hands. She had not spoken a single accusing word. Not one. Vanessa suddenly realized something she had never understood before. Claire was not trying to win. She had never been fighting at all. The shame struck harder than any punishment. Tears formed unexpectedly. She struggled to continue. I'm sorry. Alexander asked quietly to whom. Vanessa looked at Claire. For the first time that evening, there was no mockery in her eyes. Only humiliation. I am sorry. Claire. Claire blinked softly. Almost surprised. She gave the smallest nod. Thank you. Nothing more. No lecture. No triumph. Only gratitude. Mrs. Helen quietly wiped away tears. How could someone forgive so easily? Alexander observed the exchange carefully. Then he spoke again. An apology repairs words. It does not repair dignity. The great hall became silent once more. Every noble instinctively straightened. The king was not finished. He slowly removed the magnificent black cloak resting across his shoulders. The heavy royal garment was lined with dark winter fur, its clasp forged from ancient silver bearing the crest of the High Alpha. It represented authority recognized by every pack across the realm. Gasps echoed softly. Only members of the royal bloodline wore that cloak. Alexander walked toward Claire. She looked completely confused. Your Majesty. He stopped before her. Without ceremony. Without hesitation. He gently lifted the royal cloak and settled it across her shoulders. The luxurious fabric almost completely covered her stained dress. Warmth surrounded her immediately. Claire looked down in astonishment. You'll be cold. Alexander answered simply, so are you. The words struck the hall with unexpected force. Not because they were loud. Because they were true. Claire instinctively reached toward the cloak. I cannot wear this. You can. But, I said. His voice remained calm. You can. She slowly fell silent. Not from fear. From the quiet certainty in his eyes. Alexander adjusted the clasp himself. His movements remained respectful. Never hurried. Never possessive. As though restoring something that should never have been taken away. He stepped back. Now every noble saw something entirely different. The rejected Omega no longer looked invisible. Wrapped within the king's own royal cloak. She looked impossible to ignore. Vanessa stared in disbelief. No woman outside the royal family had ever received such an honor. Richard Sinclair quietly lowered his head. The elders exchanged stunned glances. Mrs. Helen covered her mouth to stop herself from crying aloud. Claire looked utterly overwhelmed. I don't understand. Alexander looked directly into her gentle blue eyes. I know. Then he turned away from her. His gaze swept across hundreds of nobles, military commanders, pack elders, merchants, warriors, servants. Every single person who had witnessed Claire's humiliation. His expression became colder than the winter moon hanging beyond the castle walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried effortlessly through every corner of the great hall. If the dignity of even the weakest member of a pack can be mocked while everyone watches in silence. He paused. Then this pack has forgotten the meaning of honor. No one dared breathe. Alexander slowly lifted one hand. His next command contained only a single word. One word powerful enough to change Claire Bennett's life forever. Kneel. One command. One word. Yet it carried enough authority to shake the pride of an entire pack. Kneel. Alexander never raised his voice. He did not need to. The order rolled across the great hall like distant thunder. Every noble froze. Every elder lowered their eyes. Even the crackling fireplaces seemed to surrender to the silence. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Then the oldest pack elder slowly bent one knee to the marble floor. The movement shattered everyone's hesitation. Military commanders followed. Council members followed. Merchants. Visiting nobles. Warriors wearing medals earned through decades of battle. One after another. The entire great hall descended. Silk brushed against polished marble. Armor clinked softly. Heavy cloaks settled upon the floor. Within moments, hundreds of proud men and women knelt together beneath the Alpha King's gaze. Only 3 people remained standing. Alexander, Claire, and Vanessa. Vanessa stared around the hall in disbelief. What? She whispered. Her voice trembled. What is happening? Her father looked up at her from one knee. Vanessa. His voice was quiet. Kneel. She shook her head. But father. Kneel. There was pain in Richard Sinclair's eyes. Not anger. Pain. He finally understood what his daughter's arrogance had cost. Vanessa slowly looked toward Claire. The rejected Omega stood wrapped in the king's royal cloak. Her stained dress remained hidden beneath its dark folds. She looked almost frightened by the attention surrounding her. She was not smiling. She was not celebrating. If anything, she looked as though she wished the evening had never happened. Vanessa suddenly felt smaller than she ever had before. With trembling legs, she slowly lowered herself onto both knees. The polished marble felt colder than winter ice. Alexander remained silent for several moments. He allowed everyone to feel the weight of the moment. Only after the entire hall had completely settled did he finally speak. Raise your heads. No one stood. Only their eyes lifted. Alexander walked slowly through the rows of kneeling nobles. His footsteps echoed softly. He stopped beside an elderly warrior whose silver hair testified to decades of service. Tell me. The old man swallowed. What is the duty of the strongest alpha? The veteran answered immediately. To protect the pack, Your Majesty. Alexander nodded once. He continued walking. He stopped beside one of the youngest noblemen present. What gives strength its purpose? The young alpha hesitated only briefly. Responsibility. Alexander continued. He finally stopped before Claire. She instinctively lowered her eyes again. He spoke so quietly that only those nearest could hear. And what is the purpose of responsibility? Claire hesitated. No one had ever asked her such a question. She searched carefully for the right words. I think. She spoke almost shyly. It exists so those with power can protect those without it. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the pack. Remember her answer. His voice became strong enough to reach every corner of the hall. Not one person here holds the title of alpha merely to enjoy respect. You carry strength because others depend upon it. He slowly swept his gaze across the kneeling nobles. When strength humiliates weakness, it ceases to be strength. It becomes cowardice. No one dared object. Richard Sinclair slowly lowered his head further. The words struck him harder than any public accusation. Alexander continued. Tonight, a young Omega entered this hall believing she possessed no value. Claire immediately looked up. She wanted to protest. She had never believed herself worthless. Only unimportant. Alexander noticed the expression crossing her face. He corrected himself. No. She believed others considered her without value. His gray eyes moved across the assembled pack. And every laugh, every whisper, every silent witness strengthened that lie. Mrs. Helen quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. Several servants openly cried. Even a number of nobles could no longer hide their shame. Alexander stopped beside the small girl named Emily. The child still knelt beside her mother. He smiled faintly. The first genuine softness anyone had seen upon his face all evening. Emily. She looked up. Yes, Your Majesty? You told the truth. The little girl nodded nervously. My grandmother says lies become heavier every time we carry them. Alexander smiled almost imperceptibly. Your grandmother is wise. He looked back toward the hall. Tonight, the smallest voice proved stronger than the loudest laughter. Emily smiled shyly. Claire's eyes became warm. She silently mouthed the words, "Thank you." The little girl smiled back. Alexander returned to the center of the great hall. Snow drifted gently beyond the towering windows. Moonlight mixed with golden candlelight across the polished marble floor. He stood beneath the enormous wolf banner hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Every eye followed him. He spoke one final time. Honor is not measured by noble blood. His voice carried absolute certainty. Nor wealth. Nor titles. It is measured by how you treat the person who cannot repay your kindness. His gaze settled upon Claire once again. Tonight, the one person who best remembered that truth was the one this pack chose to reject. The silence that followed was unlike any before. It was no longer fear. It was reflection. Deep. Painful. Necessary. Claire lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by emotions she could not name. She had spent years trying to become invisible. Yet somehow, standing beneath the king's cloak while an entire pack knelt around her, she had never felt more seen. And Alexander Ashford had only just begun to reveal why that mattered. Respect can be demanded. Trust must be earned. The Alpha King's words continued to echo through the great hall long after he had fallen silent. No one rushed to stand. No one wished to be the first. It felt as though every soul present needed another moment to examine the reflection they had just been forced to see. Alexander slowly lifted one hand. You may rise. The hall obeyed immediately. Hundreds of nobles stood together, but something had changed. They no longer looked toward one another. Many looked only at the floor. Several quietly glanced toward Claire before quickly looking away again, ashamed of how easily they had ignored her only minutes before. Claire remained frozen where she stood. The royal cloak still rested around her shoulders. Its warmth felt unfamiliar, almost undeserved. She carefully removed the embroidered handkerchief from her pocket, smoothing its folded edges without realizing she was doing it. Alexander noticed. Everything about her revealed quiet gratitude, never entitlement. Mrs. Helen finally gathered enough courage to approach. She stopped several steps away and bowed deeply. Your Majesty. Alexander nodded politely. You're the kitchen steward. Yes, Your Majesty. I believe Claire serves under your supervision. Mrs. Helen glanced at the young Omega with unmistakable affection. She does. Alexander asked only one question. What kind of worker is she? Mrs. Helen answered without hesitation. The finest I've ever known. The words came too quickly to be rehearsed, too naturally to be exaggerated. She arrives before sunrise. She never complains. If another servant falls ill, Claire quietly finishes both workloads. She often skips her own meal to make sure everyone else has eaten. Claire immediately looked embarrassed. Mrs. Helen. The older woman smiled gently. I'm only telling the truth. Alexander remained silent. Mrs. Helen continued. Many evenings I discover blankets missing from storage. I used to think someone was stealing them. She looked toward Claire. Eventually I learned she was leaving them outside the servants' quarters for elderly widows during winter. Claire's cheeks flushed crimson. They were old blankets. They weren't being used. Mrs. Helen softly shook her head. You repaired every torn corner before giving them away. Another silence settled across the room. Different this time. Not fear. Reflection. One elderly merchant quietly lowered his eyes. He had donated gold for public recognition countless times. Yet he had never quietly repaired a stranger's blanket. Alexander looked toward Claire. Is this true? She hesitated. I only thought. They needed them more. No speech. No explanation. Only the simplest answer. Alexander slowly turned toward the assembled pack. Did anyone here know this? No one answered. Because no one did. Claire had never spoken about her kindness. She had never sought praise. She simply acted. Richard Sinclair finally stepped forward. He removed the ceremonial beta medallion from around his neck. The heavy silver symbol rested in both hands. He stopped before Claire. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, the proud beta leader bowed deeply. Miss Bennet. His voice carried genuine regret. I failed you. Claire looked horrified. Please don't. You have nothing to apologize for. Richard slowly shook his head. I do. I helped build a pack where someone like you believed silence was safer than asking for justice. His words hung heavily in the air. I should have noticed. I should have protected you. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She had never expected an apology from someone so respected. She quickly answered, I never blamed you. I know. Richard whispered. That is precisely why I am ashamed. Behind him, Vanessa remained motionless. She watched her own father apologize to the Omega she had mocked. Something inside her finally broke. Not pride. Illusion. For years she had believed status determined worth. Tonight, everything she believed had collapsed. She slowly approached Claire. No one stopped her. She removed the jeweled bracelet from her own wrist. It had been crafted from white gold and moonstones. A gift from her father on her 18th birthday. She held it toward Claire with trembling hands. I don't deserve forgiveness. Claire looked confused. I wasn't asking for anything. I know. Vanessa's voice cracked. That makes this even harder. She lowered her eyes. I spent years believing kindness belonged to the weak. But tonight, the strongest person in this hall was the one I tried to humiliate. A tear slipped down her cheek. I cannot erase what I did. But if you ever find someone who needs this more than I do. She gently placed the bracelet into Claire's hand. Please give it to them. Claire stared silently at the beautiful bracelet. Then she looked back at Vanessa. Instead of closing her fingers around it, she carefully returned it. I think. She smiled softly. You should keep it. Vanessa blinked. Claire continued. That way, every time you wear it, you'll remember the person you decided to become tonight. Vanessa covered her mouth. Fresh tears filled her eyes. She slowly closed her fingers around the bracelet once more. I will. Alexander watched every word, every expression, every silence. He had entered the banquet expecting another ceremonial evening. Instead, he had witnessed something infinitely rarer than political loyalty. He had witnessed a soul that refused to answer cruelty with cruelty. He quietly walked toward the enormous windows overlooking the castle courtyard. Snow continued falling beneath the pale moon. Behind the frozen gardens, the ancient wolf statues stood beneath white blankets of winter. Without turning around, he spoke. There is one matter still unresolved. The room immediately became attentive again. Alexander slowly faced the hall. His gray eyes rested upon Claire, then upon the elders. Finally, upon every noble present. The pack has spent years deciding who Claire Bennet was. He paused. Without ever asking who she truly belonged to. The elders exchanged uncertain glances. Richard frowned slightly. Claire looked completely bewildered. Alexander's expression remained unreadable. The answer, he said quietly, arrived in the capital 3 days ago. And for the second time that evening, the entire great hall forgot how to breathe. The truth does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes, it arrives folded inside an old piece of parchment. Alexander stood motionless beneath the towering wolf banner. No one dared interrupt him. The entire Great Hall remained suspended between curiosity and disbelief. Claire's fingers tightened unconsciously around the edge of the royal cloak. She had no idea what the king meant. She had never belonged to anyone. Not really. Her parents had died when she was still a child. Or at least, that was the only story she had ever been told. Alexander slowly looked toward the chamberlain standing near the entrance. "Bring it." The elderly chamberlain bowed deeply. "As you command, Your Majesty." He disappeared through the great oak doors. The hall filled once again with anxious whispers. What document? What answer? Who could she possibly belong to? Even Vanessa forgot her humiliation for a moment. She stared at Claire with growing confusion. Claire herself looked almost frightened. She quietly stepped toward Alexander. "Your Majesty." Her voice was barely audible. "I think there has been some mistake." Alexander turned toward her. "There has." His answer was calm, but not the one you imagine. Several moments later, the chamberlain returned. In both hands, he carefully carried a long wooden case carved from ancient walnut. Its surface bore the faded crest of the royal archive. Only documents of extraordinary importance were preserved inside such cases. He stopped before the king, bowed, then presented it with both hands. Alexander opened the case himself. Inside rested a single weathered scroll wrapped in dark blue ribbon. Time had yellowed the parchment. The wax seal, though cracked with age, still carried the unmistakable symbol of the High Alpha crown. Alexander carefully lifted it. "There are records," he began quietly, "that even pack leaders never see." The elders exchanged uncertain glances. One of the oldest among them slowly frowned. He recognized the royal seal. Alexander continued. 22 years ago, a winter caravan traveling through Black Pine Pass was attacked during a blizzard. Several elderly nobles nodded faintly. Some remembered hearing stories of the tragedy. Most travelers perished. A rescue party found only scattered wagons buried beneath snow. He paused. But one child survived. Claire felt an unfamiliar chill race through her body. Alexander slowly looked at her. A little girl, wrapped inside a heavy wool blanket. Too young to remember her own name. The great hall fell utterly silent. Alexander gently unrolled the ancient scroll. The official report stated that no living relatives could be found. Mrs. Helen slowly covered her mouth. Richard Sinclair frowned. Something about the story felt strangely familiar. Alexander's voice remained steady. The child was placed under temporary pack protection. Years passed. The investigation ended. The records were sealed. Claire whispered almost involuntarily, "Why?" Alexander answered before she could finish. Because the investigation was incomplete. Every eye remained fixed upon him. He continued. 3 weeks ago, workers restoring the Western Archive uncovered another collection of documents hidden behind a collapsed stone wall. The chamberlain nodded quietly. They had remained untouched for over 2 decades. Alexander lifted another folded page from the wooden case. This document was among them. He looked toward the royal archivist standing near the wall. "Read it." The elderly archivist stepped forward carefully. He adjusted his spectacles, then began reading. Identification record. Recovered personal belongings. One silver pendant engraved with the initials. He paused briefly. C.B. Claire instinctively reached toward the simple silver pendant hidden beneath her dress. The tiny necklace she had worn for as long as she could remember. Mrs. Helen gasped softly. "You've always worn it." Claire nodded faintly. "I never knew where it came from." The archivist continued reading. Infant believed to be female. Estimated age, 11 months. Temporary designation. He swallowed. Claire Bennett. The hall erupted into astonished murmurs. Richard Sinclair looked completely stunned. Temporary. Alexander nodded once. The rescue captain assigned her a surname. It was never her birth name. Claire felt her knees weaken. Everything she believed about herself suddenly seemed uncertain. "My name," she whispered, "isn't mine." Alexander looked at her gently. "It became yours. But it was never the name given to you at birth. Silence. Pure. Overwhelming. The archivist unfolded one final document. His hands trembled slightly. Supplementary report. Recovered after investigation resumed. Confirmed identity of missing child. His voice grew quieter. Daughter of. He stopped. Looked toward Alexander. The king gave a slow nod. The archivist took a deep breath. Daughter of Lord Christopher Hawthorne. The great hall exploded into stunned disbelief. The Hawthornes? Impossible. They disappeared years ago. One of the oldest noble bloodlines. Richard Sinclair stared speechless. Even the elders looked shaken. Vanessa's eyes widened. She knew the name. Every noble child grew up hearing stories about House Hawthorne. A family renowned not for wealth, but for honor. The family that had donated lands during famine, sheltered refugees during war, protected abandoned omegas without demanding service in return. Claire could barely breathe. She looked completely lost. I don't remember them. Alexander stepped closer. You were never expected to. You were still an infant. A single tear slipped quietly down Claire's cheek. If they searched for me, what happened? Alexander's expression became solemn. They never stopped. The room became silent again. The search continued for years. Your father exhausted nearly his entire fortune funding rescue expeditions. Claire closed her eyes. Another tear followed. My father. Alexander lowered his voice. He never believed you were dead. He carefully folded the ancient documents once more, then looked directly into Claire's tear-filled eyes. And tomorrow morning, he said softly, the man who never stopped searching for his daughter will finally walk through those castle doors. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in a single evening, the rejected Omega who believed she had no family had just learned that someone had spent 21 years refusing to give up hope. Some reunions are loud. The ones that change your soul forever happen in complete silence. Dawn arrived beneath a sky washed in silver. Snow rested quietly upon the castle towers. The storm that had battered the kingdom throughout the night had disappeared, leaving behind a world so still that every footstep across the frozen courtyard echoed like a heartbeat. Inside the great hall, no banquet tables remained. The musicians were gone. The laughter had vanished. Only expectation remained. Pack elders stood together near the throne. Military commanders lined the walls in ceremonial armor. Servants waited silently beside the enormous entrance doors. No one had been ordered to attend. Yet almost everyone had come, not to witness a royal decree, but to witness hope. Claire stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the castle gate. The royal cloak had been carefully folded and returned to Alexander earlier that morning. She once again wore her simple dress. Mrs. Helen had spent half the night removing every trace of dried wine from the fabric. Only the faintest shadow remained. Claire gently touched the silver pendant resting against her chest. Temporary designation. Claire Bennett. The words continued echoing inside her mind. If Bennett was never truly her name, who was she? More frightening still, who was waiting beyond those gates? Alexander quietly approached. He stopped beside her. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Snowflakes drifted slowly beyond the glass. Finally, Claire whispered, "What if he isn't the man I imagined?" Alexander answered without looking away from the courtyard. "He won't be." Claire blinked. He continued, "The father you imagined exists only inside 21 years of unanswered questions. The man arriving today has spent those same 21 years living without answers." Claire lowered her eyes. "I don't know how to meet someone who never stopped searching for me." Alexander looked toward her. "You don't." She frowned slightly. "You simply meet your father." His voice remained calm. Nothing more. Something inside Claire eased. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. Suddenly, a distant horn sounded from beyond the castle walls. Every conversation stopped instantly. The guards atop the towers straightened. Another horn answered. Then another. The great entrance doors slowly opened. Cold winter air swept through the hall. A captain hurried inside and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty." The Hawthorne escort has entered the castle. No one moved. Outside, hooves struck frozen stone. One rider. Not an army. Not a noble procession. Just one horseman followed at a respectful distance by royal guards. The sound grew closer. Step, 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 until finally, a tall man entered the great hall. His winter cloak was faded from years of travel. Snow covered his boots. Gray streaks touched his dark hair. His face carried deep lines carved not by age, but by grief. He removed neither his gloves nor his cloak. He seemed unable to think beyond what stood before him. His eyes searched desperately across the hall. Searching. Always searching. Then, they found her. Claire. Everything else disappeared. The man stopped walking. His lips parted slightly. His breathing became uneven. His hands trembled. For a long moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. It was impossible to recognize someone last seen as an infant. Yet, somehow, both hearts already knew. The man slowly reached inside his cloak. Several guards instinctively tensed. Alexander quietly lifted one hand. Stand down. The stranger withdrew only a small leather pouch. His fingers shook as he opened it. Inside rested another silver pendant. Its shape matched the one hanging around Claire's neck. He stepped forward carefully. One slow step, then another, until only a few feet separated them. Without speaking, he held the pendant beside hers. The two broken halves fit together perfectly. A tiny engraved wolf appeared where the edges joined. Claire stared at them. Her hands began trembling. The man finally found his voice. It was rough, broken, almost afraid. When? He swallowed painfully. When you were born, your mother ordered a pendant made. He smiled through tears. She said, if our daughter ever became lost, she should always carry half of home. Claire could no longer stop crying. The stranger's own tears slipped freely down his face. I looked for you. His voice cracked completely. In every village, every orphanage, every pack, every kingdom willing to open its gates. I buried empty graves because I had nothing else to bury. I refused to believe they belonged to you. The great hall remained utterly silent. Not one noble lowered their eyes. Many openly wept. Richard Sinclair quietly removed his spectacles to wipe away tears. Mrs. Helen held Emily close against her shoulder. Even Vanessa cried without hiding it. The man slowly dropped to one knee. Not before the king. Before his daughter. I'm sorry. Claire immediately shook her head through tears. No. He continued anyway. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you suffered alone. I'm sorry another father protected you before I could. He glanced respectfully toward Alexander. Then back to Claire. I cannot ask you to call me father. I haven't earned that right. Claire stared at him. Every lonely birthday. Every unanswered question. Every night wondering whether anyone in the world remembered her. They all disappeared beneath one simple truth. Someone had never stopped loving her. She crossed the final distance between them. Instead of speaking, she knelt too, then gently placed both trembling hands against his face. Exactly as though trying to memorize someone she had somehow always known. A faint smile appeared through her tears. You've been looking for me, she whispered. For 21 years. He nodded, unable to speak. Claire leaned forward, rested her forehead against his, then quietly said the one word he had waited a lifetime to hear. Father. The broken man closed his eyes. For the first time in 21 years, his search was finally over. Across the great hall, Alexander watched in silence. He did not interrupt. He did not claim credit. He simply turned toward the great windows, allowing a father and daughter to reclaim the years that fate had stolen. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight broke through the winter clouds. And for the first time since anyone could remember, the pack understood that true nobility had never been determined by birth alone. It had always been revealed by the courage to protect, the humility to repent, and the love that refused to surrender, even after 21 years.